I'm really far behind on my card reviews, so I'm really just going to try to power through this. First up is Grimestreet Informant. This card doesn't really impress me too much. 2-mana 1/1 is super weak. We have Jeweled Scarab in the game already, and the card sees like no play. It's a little bit different than Jeweled Scarab, because you're more likely to discover something big and more impactful, whereas Jeweled Scarab always gives you an early game card. But I think the issue with Jeweled Scarab is mostly just that it's a 2-mana 1/1, and of course Grimestreet Informant has the same issue as that. There's the dream of playing Hunter and getting like nice control cards from Warrior or from Paladin, or if you're playing Hunter, sometimes you can get Mysterious Challenger and pull out a bunch of secrets, but I don't think any of those things are too reliable. In general, I think the Discover effect on this card is just a little bit too random for people to really want to play it. Next up we have Lotus Agents. This card kind of has the same problems as Grimestreet Informant in my opinion. It's understated for the cost, the battle cry is a little bit too random, and this card also compares very directly to Azure Drake, which I think is probably just better, especially in Druid, Rogue, and Shaman where you can play Lotus Agents. So I think Azure Drake is probably just going to edge this card out of seeing too much play. It's got a better body, it's got the spell damage. It's a much more reliable effect. There's some chance that this card can give you a pretty sweet healing effect in Rogue, which they don't really have access to. But again, I just think cards like this are a little bit too random to really be reliable. I feel pretty much the same about Kabal Courier as I did about the previous two cards. It's understated, it's a little bit too random. When you're discovering from Mage, Priest, and Warlock cards, you do have a pretty good chance at discovering like an AoE spell, so maybe that's something reliable that you can do with this card. But in general, I think it's also just going to be too random. Of these three tri-class cards, I don't think any of them are like trash tier. I think you could see them played in like Reno decks or something, or maybe some like really off-the-wall control deck. But I don't think any of them are going to be deck defining. I just don't think they have that power level. I think they're a bit too random. But like, if you put them in your deck, you're probably not going to lose too much win percentage by playing them, so I think they're all just kind of okay cards. Kazakus is a super powerful card. If you don't know what this card does, you're going to have to just look it up because it's a little bit too much to explain. But basically the power of this card lies in its flexibility. You can play it on turn 5 with a 1-mana spell, or just play it on turn 4, curve into a 5-mana spell, turn 9, play it and a 5-mana spell, or just discover a 10-mana spell and play that. You have all kinds of crazy effects that are going to be really good in different situations. I think this card is absolutely going to see play in every Reno deck that can play it, and Reno is around for a few more months. The real question is, will this survive the rotation of Reno Jackson at the beginning of next year? And that kind of remains to be seen. This card is so like crazy and has so much variation to it that it's something you really have to play with a lot to truly understand the power level. So I think it's a bit too early to say how good this card will be without Reno, but with Reno in the game, I think this card will definitely see some amount of play. Maybe even a lot of play. Mistress of Mixtures is a really cool card. It's a 1-drop that you can play in non-aggro decks, which we don't really have at all in Hearthstone right now. The 1-mana 2/2 fights on board fairly well, but it's not like crazy good on board. Zombie Chow is so good because there were 2/1 Leper Gnomes, 2/1 Abusive Sergeants, and it could survive combat with those and then also kill 2-drops. Mistress of Mixtures doesn't really have that advantage. Nowadays we have a lot of 1/3s that buff themselves, like Mana Worm and Tunnel Trog. With one buff, those guys actually just kill the Mistress of Mixtures pretty easily. But I think a 1-mana 2/2 is still worth playing in a control deck if you want a 1-drop. Much more worth playing than like an Argent Squire, which would probably be your next best alternative if you wanted to play a 1-drop in a control deck. You also get the nice healing effect, but the heal in this card is a bit weird. Usually when you need healing in Hearthstone, it's because you're about to die, and obviously if this card has a death rattle, it's not that easy to get the healing immediately, because you just put it on the board, then your opponent ignores it and kills you. And chances are if you're playing this on turn 1, you don't really get the healing effect on turn 1, because you're probably still at 30 even against an aggressive deck. So the heal on this is more just kind of like a mid-game thing. If you have it on the board and you're at like 12 health or something, then maybe it can prevent the opponent from killing you a few turns later. But if you're at 1 health against a hunter, this card isn't going to help you. It's also worth noting that Hearthstone doesn't really have too many face decks right now. It's stuff like Zoo and Shaman that just beats you on board and then kills you because of that, rather than just punching you in the face. And in those matchups, this card is actually not even that strong. I like the card a lot in terms of design, but I think it might be deceptively weak because people are so readily comparing it to Zombie Chow, which it doesn't really live up to. But I do expect it to see at least some amount of play, and who knows, it might even be a great card. Second rate Bruiser. I really liked this card a lot when I first saw it, but the more I think about it, the less I like it. It's just actually not that easy to play this card on turn 3, which is where it would really shine. You can really only do it against Zoo. Even Shaman, which is like notoriously good at keeping a board, they're not going to have 3 minions on the board on turn 3. They're just going like Trogg into Totem Golem, and then this guy still costs 5 mana. So this card isn't really that good in a lot of matchups, and against Zoo, if you just play this into their Flame Imp, then they're just going to drop an Abusive Sergeant on their Flame Imp and kill your 3 mana card for 1 mana plus a 1 mana Battlecry. So even in the matchups where it's pretty good, it's still not that hard for them to deal with. If you can consistently play it as a 3 mana 4/5 taunt, it's pretty solid, but I don't think it's good enough to make up for the times where this is a 5 mana 4/5 taunt. I think those are actually going to be pretty common. Maybe this card could see play as like your 30th in a Reno deck, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly powerful card. I think Friendly Bartender is a little bit underrated. I don't think it's a great card, but I think it's definitely playable. It doesn't give you a huge burst of healing, but 1 HP every turn can add up, since a lot of the time when you stabilize against an aggressive deck, they have a few turns to draw into their burn. And even if you only get 1 heal out of it, that does help you play around an exact 2-turn lethal that the opponent set up. So even though it's only 1 a turn, I think there are a lot of situations where 1 healing per turn is going to be enough, and over a couple turns it can definitely add up. And even in the worst case scenario, you can still just play this as a 2 mana 2/3. Obviously a 2 mana 2/3 is not great, but I kind of compared this card to Flame Juggler, a card that people thought wouldn't see any play when it was revealed in the Grand Tournament, and it turns out there just aren't that many good 2-drops, so you start looking at kind of mediocre cards like Flame Juggler. I think Friendly Bartender is on roughly the same power level as Flame Juggler, so I kind of like the card. I don't think it's going to be in every deck, but I think it's okay. Finja the Flying Star is a really cool card. I was a little bit underwhelmed by this card at first, but the more I think about it, I think it's like almost an auto-include in Murloc Paladin, or in the Anyfin version of Murloc Paladin anyway. The most important thing for that deck is just finding its Murlocs, which this card obviously lets you do. The problem is that you have to actually kill something with it, but since it has stealth and 4 health, it's very likely to live until you can attack with it, and in the matchups where you really need to find your Murlocs, against the like more aggressive decks and mid-range decks, I think you're pretty likely to find something you can kill. Something just like a totem from Shaman, some garbage minion from Zoo, a Sorcerer's Apprentice, those kinds of things. In the matchups like Control Warrior, where they're not likely to have something for you to kill, I think you're already pretty favored with Murloc Paladin anyway, so I think this card fits pretty nicely in that deck. Also, since you're playing War Leaders and Bluegills, the fact that this guy only has 2 attack is somewhat mitigated. You can just run a Bluegill in first or just like play a War Leader, then this guy has 4 power, so he trades a lot better. I think this card actually fits pretty well in that deck. I would also like to see this guy played in more of a mid-range Murloc Paladin, something that plays like Vilefin Inquisitor, to change your hero power to make Murlocs, and then it also plays Murloc War Leader as kind of its pseudo Quartermaster in that kind of deck. The deck hasn't really existed, but I sure like the idea of it, and I think Finja the Flying Star fits pretty well in that deck. We've also seen, since I'm so late with this card review, that there are some more Murlocs being announced later on. So maybe if those other Murlocs make more Murloc archetypes, then Finja will fit in those decks too. I think the possibility of pulling 2 specific kinds of cards out of your deck, and even just putting them onto the board, is extremely powerful, so this is definitely a card to watch out for. Patches the Pirate is a pretty crazy card. You kind of want to compare it to Stone Tusk Boar, but this card is so much better. You don't have to pay mana for this card, and you don't even have to pay a card for this card since it's getting pulled out of your deck. It's basically just a buff to the first pirate you play every game, so instead of playing a 2 mana 2/3, you're playing a 2 mana 2/3 with a 1/1 charger attached to it, which makes the card significantly better. Also, since you're pulling this card out of your deck, you're effectively playing with a 29 card deck in most games, so if you're playing like Pirate Warrior, you're just like a few percentage points more likely to draw your Arcanite Reaper on turn 5 to finish off your opponent. The reason this card is good is kind of the same reason that Prince Malchezaar was bad, because having fewer cards in your deck is better when you're trying to draw into stuff. So I think this card is basically an auto-include in pretty much every pirate deck. Just the fact that you basically don't pay anything for it, and it makes your deck better, means that this card is just like crazy good. I don't know if this card is good enough to make pirate decks a thing, but if there's an existing pirate deck, you just throw patches into it. There's also some pretty interesting stuff you can do with Gang Up in this card, because if you have multiple copies of Patches the Pirate in your deck, all of them do get summoned, and summoning an entire army whenever you play a pirate is pretty OP. But you do have to play Gang Up. It's a 2-card combo, but you don't have to draw into the Patches, which is pretty nice. But you also don't have control of when your Patches comes out, or not that much control. So maybe sometimes it dies before you draw your Gang Up, and then it's pretty bad. But if you get the combo to work, it is pretty strong, so it'll be interesting to see if that plays out. Fel Orc Soulfiend is a pretty interesting card. It's a 3-mana 3/7, but it kills itself, so it's kind of weird. A lot of times this card is just going to effectively trade as if it were a 3-mana 3/3, because you play it, it damages itself down to a 3/5, then you can attack with it, and then it damages itself again and it probably dies. But the interesting thing is, it's like a 3-mana 3/3 that your opponent can't very reasonably prevent from attacking them. So even though the value of its trades doesn't really change too much, the opponent can't prevent it from trading as easily as just casting a quick shot or something like that on this card. And I think there is some value to that maybe is being a little bit overlooked. A lot of people want to just play this card in Priest, because obviously you can heal it up to kind of mitigate the drawback. But I think if you're investing 2 mana a turn into mitigating the effect of this card, that's not really worth your effort. It's also a pretty good target in Priest for a card like Purify, which kind of justifies the card's existence. And a 3-mana 3/7, if you just silence off the bad text on this card, is pretty strong. I think you almost certainly just play 2 copies of this card in the Silence Priest if that's a thing. I think there's even some chance that this is just a good card that you just put into a mid-range deck, regardless of what class you're playing, because of the way I described it trading. 3-mana 3/7 is a lot of stats to deal with, or more reasonably a 3-mana 3/5 is a lot of stats to deal with if you want to prevent it from trading. But it's also possible that this card just sees no play, because oftentimes it's just going to be a 3-mana 3/3. I think that's more likely, but if this was a sleeper OP card, I wouldn't be that surprised. Next up we have Kooky Chemist. So this is basically just a big Crazed Alchemist. And the problem with that is, if you want the effect on Crazed Alchemist, you'd rather pay 2 mana for it than 4 mana. When you scale this card up, you go from a 2-mana 2/2 with a Battle Cry, and then your additional 2 mana for Kooky Chemist is only a 2-mana 2/2. So it doesn't scale up that efficiently. And I think generally any deck that would want to play Kooky Chemist would rather just play Crazed Alchemist. Maybe this makes some pretty cool deck where you can have 4 of this effect, but I don't think this effect is really strong enough to justify playing a deck based around it. I think it's a cool card, but it won't see too much play, I'm pretty confident in saying. Big Time Racketeer is kind of an interesting card. If you're just playing it as a dude, it's basically just Boulder Fist Ogre, and that's not good enough for Constructed, because Boulder Fist Ogre doesn't see play. But you can do some kind of interesting things with it with Brand Bronzebeard. On turn 9 you can get 2 6/6s, but on turn 9 just spending your entire turn putting a couple fat dudes on the board isn't actually that strong. So I'm not sure that's really worth your investment. I feel like there are better things you could be doing with your Bran. This card is also kind of interesting in Evolve Shaman, because a 6-mana 1/1 is a very good target for an Evolve, and the 6/6 you summon also costs 6 mana. So 7 mana and 2 cards for 2 random 7/7s? That could be strong, but I suspect there might be better Evolve targets. I don't think this card is going to see too much play. I think it's just too weak on its own, and the combos with it aren't really particularly strong either. Wind Up Burglebot. Wow, this card is really bad. The most awful thing about this card is that it has the word burgle in the name, but does not use the burgle mechanic. It just draws a card, which is super lame. But a 6-mana 5/5 draw a card, even if you ignore the fact that the draw is conditional, 6-mana 5/5 draw a card is actually not even that good. And then when you consider that you're probably not even going to get the draw most of the time, it's just going to be a 6-mana 5/5, this card is just super weak. It starts getting pretty good if you can draw multiple cards off of it, like if you're somehow against a shaman that just keeps making totems and can't deal 5 damage. And then I guess this card is pretty strong, but that's never going to happen. And if you're using this to kill real minions, then it's taking combat damage, and it's never going to survive more than 1 battle. So this card is just bad. Even if you get 1 draw out of it, it's still bad. and you're pretty much never going to get multiple draws out of it, so it's just weak. It'll never see competitive play. Grook Fu Master, this card is trash too. 5 mana 3/5 is an awful stat line. Wind Fury is just not a strong ability. It doesn't do anything the turn you play it, and then the turn you actually get use out of the Wind Fury effect, you're still taking combat damage. Like if you play this into a thing from below, you don't even get 2 attacks out of it, it just dies because it's a 5 mana 3/5 and they have a 5/5 taunt. So Wind Fury is just weak. There are some like cute, interesting things that you can do with like throwing Cold Bloods on it for OTKs, maybe you can seal it first. But if that was worth doing, people would already be playing Wind Fury Harpy or Thrallmar Farseer. Wind Fury just isn't good on its own, so this card won't see any play. Auctionmaster Beardo is just like such a weird card to me. It seems like any place where I would want to play this card, I would rather just play Garrison Commander, and Garrison Commander hasn't seen any competitive play. There are a few classes that wouldn't mind using their hero power multiple times, but 2 hero powers plus Auctionmaster Beardo is already 7 mana. Then you have to have a spell that you can play along with it. The card is just so slow and so situational. You can do some interesting things in Warrior, with like tank up, shield slam, tank up again, but you'd still rather be using Garrison Commander because then you can start with your 2 tank ups before the shield slam. You can deal 8 damage instead of 4. I just don't really see a place for this card. I think the most interesting application of this is going to be putting a spider tank in your all legendary deck. So I think this card is pretty weak. And that wraps up the first wave of neutral cards. Hopefully I was able to keep it brief. Hopefully I didn't keep it too brief. And hopefully I'll get on to the first set of class cards pretty soon. And hopefully after that I'll be better at keeping up with the cards as they're announced.